when we talk about why carbon pricing is a challenge, to talk about what actuaries can do, and to say, okay, we know what we need to do, and the first step is at least finding a universal carbon pricing. So I want to briefly introduce our speakers today who are going to start the conversation. With us is Sheila. Sheila is a qualified actuary. She's currently working at Old Mutual. She has been in the regions for an actuarial manager for the Africa regions of Old Mutual, serving other countries in the south and in the east, Namibia, Rwanda, just to mention a couple of countries. She's passionate about education. She's passionate about the ESG. She's passionate about insurance being a solution to drive economic recovery and to drive economic change. So, and we are really looking forward to hearing your wonderful voice and your opinion on carbon pricing and what we can do about it. Welcome, Sheila. Everyone, I think let's give a thumbs up to Sheila. I know we cannot clap, but we can all react. So thumbs up for Sheila. Yay. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the thumbs up. And we also have John, who's retired actuary. He has been working for the Bank of England up to 2021 and is also passionate about ESG, sustainability, climate governance, culture, behavior, and exploring the ways in which all these other functions affect our focus on risk, affect our focus on how we live our life, because being an actuary is a way of life, to not just make a lot of money, but to also impact our culture. So John is using his time in retirement to donate his voice and give his voice to important subjects like ESG, to think about how we can make a difference in this actuarial world. So welcome, John. Thumbs up for John. Yay. Great, 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 John. So wonderful. So I think we are all curious, John and Sheila, before we even begin the controversy or the discussion. What did Mo Ibrahima say? How do we measure a ton? What did President Ruto say? What's the price? Whose price is better than the other? Can you just briefly, for those of us who've not interacted well with the subject, really just explain to us what is carbon pricing? And just how can we leave with one takeaway about what carbon pricing is? Welcome, Sheila.
Thank you, Lorraine. Thank you, Lorraine, and thank you for that very nice introduction. So yes, you are right that John and I are both passionate about ESG, and maybe just a bit of background in terms of the interest that we share. We really believe that the whole conversation around ESG can have a lot of impact. And so that's what drives the both of us to actually see the whole conversation being impact driven. So I'll go straight into your question on what carbon pricing is. And whenever I want to understand a new concept, I always like starting from what I know and then moving to what is unknown, right? So let's start at the basic level from what is a price, right? So for example, I have my cup of coffee here. So when I bought a jar of coffee in the supermarket, what did the price of that jar of coffee represents? A price represents value, right? So in the case of in the case of a jar of coffee, the value that is being represented in the price is the value of the coffee bean, the value of all the processing that had to go into the coffee bean, the value of the jar itself, the packaging, the value of the transport, right? So that is a price is basically a representation of the value of something. And in the case of coffee, it's a representation of all those steps that are taken to actually create that jar of coffee. And so there's nothing different when we're talking about a carbon price. It is also a representation of value. So that's the first thing that we can establish. Carbon pricing is not some mysterious term. It is actually a price just like any other. So now we are going to talk about, fine, we are pricing the value of something. What is that something? So with carbon pricing, we are placing a value on carbon emissions. And as Lorraine kind of introduced us, we are all gunning towards reaching net zero emissions. And so The reason that we need to have a price for carbon is so that we can reduce emissions. So we are placing a value on carbon dioxide, right? But then again, now that is too general. We can't just say this is the value of carbon dioxide. We need to assign a measurement to it. So when it comes to carbon pricing, normally we are measuring 1 ton of carbon dioxide being emitted, right? So that's what we're measuring. So how the price is quoted, you would say, for example, the price of 1 ton of carbon dioxide is $10. So $10 for every ton of carbon dioxide emitted. That is how we normally quote the carbon pricing amounts. And so there's many different challenges with that, Lorraine, because you'll find that even the way a ton is measured is different in different countries. So a ton in the UK is different from a ton in the US and so on. So already, as I explain the definition of a carbon price, we can really start to see some of the challenges because we are saying it's 1 ton of carbon dioxide being emitted, but already, even just with that definition of a ton, there's a difference in terms of how different countries describe what a ton is. And then just a little bit about why we are pricing carbon dioxide. The reason we need a carbon price, and Lorraine, you alluded to it, is that we all want to move towards net zero emissions. And what the governments around the world have agreed is that we're going to do this through carbon taxes and or carbon credits or carbon offsets. And we're going to be going into those definitions as we go on with the webinar. So for you to impose a carbon tax or to talk about the fund that Mo Ibrahim was talking about in the webinar, you need a price to it. And so that is the reason for putting a price on carbon dioxide. Then I'll just tackle two more things around the definition of carbon pricing. Firstly, why carbon dioxide? If you look at other gases like methane, for example, methane actually traps more heat in the atmosphere. So why not use methane instead of carbon dioxide? And there are two quick answers to that. Firstly, is that carbon dioxide actually sticks in the atmosphere for much longer. So 40% of carbon dioxide emitted can remain in the atmosphere for 100 years, 20% resides for more than 1,000 years, and 10% for more than 10,000 years. So carbon dioxide has a much more longer lasting effect than gases like methane. And then secondly, carbon dioxide is just much more abundant in the atmosphere. When you drive your car, if it's fuel based, you're emitting carbon dioxide. You know, when someone burns coal and so on, that is emitting carbon dioxide. So it's a much more urgent and pertinent issue to address carbon dioxide. So the generally accepted gas that we talk about with carbon pricing is carbon dioxide. And then lastly, what are some of the considerations that come about when coming up with, when a country, say, wants to come up with the price of carbon dioxide? So there's many different factors. Number one, of course, the country. Like I said, different countries have different metric systems. So a ton in the UK is different to a ton in the US and so on. And then also the type of use. Carbon prices normally vary by type of use. So whether it's for retail, manufacturing, and so on. There's also by the type of energy source. For example, coal emits much more than other sources of fuel and so on. So yes, in summary, Lorraine, a price is a measure of value. So with carbon pricing, we're measuring the value of carbon dioxide emissions, carbon dioxide for the reasons that I've mentioned. And normally it's quoted as a dollar price or a pound price per ton of carbon dioxide.
Okay. Thank you so much for that question, for that response, Sheila. I just want to give it an actuarial angle. You know, we are actuaries. You know, we love assumptions, we love methodologies, we love myths, we love stories around the numbers we create. What are some of the assumptions that you use? You mentioned why we use carbon and not any other gas, but what are some of the other assumptions that a country can lean on and say, okay, so you have carbon, and then how do you move from just a value of carbon to an actual number? What are some of the assumptions that a country can use to value this?
One of the easiest examples is fuel. So normally you can tell how much fuel you're using, right? So you can say maybe 16 gallons of fuel that can easily be equated to the amount of carbon dioxide emitted. That's an easy one because now you know how many gallons of fuel you use for a certain number of kilometers. So using that particular equation, then you can tell how much carbon dioxide is emitted. So
Oh,
yes, it's
fun.
through simple and known factors such as the number of kilometers that you travel, because now that relates to the amount of fuel that you use.
Oh, that's fantastic. So one key takeaway we can take about from this is that the amount of fuel that is emitted, the amount of carbon dioxide that is emitted from a certain type of fuel usage, that literally equates to your carbon dioxide pricing, among any other things. So the basic methodologies around fuel usage and the CO2 emitted per fuel type. Okay, I think that's very clear for everyone.
And Lorraine, maybe I can just add that anyone can do this on their own. If you go online, you can actually find very many resources to help you calculate your own carbon footprint. So, like I recently bought an electric car, not electric, a hybrid car. And so it feels good to know that I'm playing my part in addressing global warming. But yeah, if you're driving a fuel-based car, for example, you could actually make it a conscious thing to start measuring the amount of carbon dioxide you're emitting. It's very easy to check online through a tool. If you put in the number of kilometers you drive in a day, for example, it can easily calculate that for you. So again, it's not such a complex topic that is out there. It's something that you can even do yourself if you want to understand it properly. And there's many tools online. The same things goes for flights. If you're going on, say, a 5 hour flight, you can actually go online and check. So how much carbon dioxide will I be contributing to? So Lorraine, it's actually a very practical way of measuring. So the only problem is now in the differences, which we're going to go into during this webinar.
Thank you. Fantastic. Yes, John, please supplement.
It might help people if they use the equation that 1,000 gallons of petrol is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide.
So we all have an equation of the day. 1,000 liters of petrol equals
1 ton.
1 ton. Wonderful.
I'm using gallons rather than liters. But
Can put that in the chat.
So I'm gonna put that in the
Equation of
chat
the
for
day.
everyone. So 1,000 liters
I was
equals
using gallons. Sorry.
1,000 gallons, do you say?
Yeah.
Equals a ton of CO2 emissions. So at least we have one takeaway for today. So, and I just wanted to ask you, John, now that you are on the mic, why is this conversation about carbon pricing so critical for climate change? How do we go from carbon pricing to climate change being addressed? It just feels like a very wide range, feels like a very long journey. And how can we break down the strap to say carbon pricing directly affects climate change in these 3 ways, and this is why we must fight for it?
Well, probably the biggest impact on global warming is carbon emissions. And global warming, as we know from the news at the moment, is really important for the heat waves we're getting in the Mediterranean and North Africa. And it's probably one of the most important aspects of climate change is the global warming and how we can reduce that. And we've had an annual COP meeting of the nations, the Conference of the Peoples, and the COP 21 in 2015 in Paris tried to set this limit on global warming to 2% with a ideal target of 1.5%, sorry, not percent, degrees, 2 degrees. And the biggest incentive to try and cut emissions is a tax. So if something becomes more expensive, you use less of it. So every country has been considering what price they can put on carbon, which is another name for a tax, really, that incentivize business to use less and people to use less, because it won't come voluntarily. So the price of carbon is really important to help global warming. To some extent, any tax helps the government raise money as well. And the offset against that is that higher taxes also mean higher prices of goods. So it's not a very popular thing to raise a tax. No one wants higher taxes, but I think the COP meetings have acknowledged that there is a need for every country to look at their emissions and consider a tax. And the question then is how you actually set the price of carbon so that you get the appropriate tax to meet the needs of reducing the emissions while not harming the economy as well. And there's this constant conflict which raises lots of issues.
And so just talking about the conversation about tax and harming the economy, right? There will be financial implications if you're suddenly making countries, businesses, because countries are not going to pay it out of their pockets, right? They're going to rely on taxes from people, businesses, and so on and so forth, right? What are the financial implications of increasing taxes, so to say, for those nations? How would their economies be affected if they're now suddenly having to pay a carbon pricing tax, for example, or a carbon tax?
I think this is where the help of the actuary can actually come in, because there are lots of factors involved that a government has to consider. There are both the political problems, and then there are those factors, some of which Sheila has covered already, in terms of type of fuel and type of industry. Every country is different, and every country's got different industry and different climate, etc. So there's this need to come up with a basis of equating the price or the tax of carbon products to reduce emissions. And I think the skills of the actuary come into play here, because actuaries are typically problem solvers. They've got knowledge of insurance and finance and economics and demography and risk and models. And I think there's an opportunity here for actuaries to devise a way, work with others to come up with a model or models that actually come up, probably not with one universal price. I think there's a range of prices that might differ by fuel, might differ by country, whatever, but something that's in harmony, across the world, so that you've got a better fairness. This is what the original President Ruto had come up with. There's an unfairness on Africa that needs to be sorted, and I think African actuaries can be one way of helping find the solution.
And maybe to just keep talking about the tax, how the tax will work, Sheila, could you please summarize what your article had in terms of the tax methodology, how it would work, and why is this a drawback? Why is this not a methodology that we can rely on? And how is it going to work? And why is this not a credible methodology to use that will be effective?
So, Lorraine, I'll actually pick up from comments that's been made in the chat that there's an agreed upon scientific methodology for coming up with a carbon price. That's correct. But the reality is that we have very many different carbon prices that are applicable in many different countries. And as John said, it varies by country. Like in the US, it even varies by state. If you go to different states, there's a different carbon price. So, the drawbacks, or rather, I wouldn't, let me say the challenges. The challenges with that is that, so firstly, what is a carbon price used for? A government would use it to either impose a higher tax on those who are emitting more, or to give tax credits or tax offsets to those, so how tax credits would work is that if I am emitting more, I can be allowed to emit more up to a certain limit if I invest in a project that actually reduces carbon emissions. For example, if I have a factory that has emissions, then I can actually buy credits or offsets. So, for example, I'd be investing in a forestation project, for example, and then that would allow me to continue emitting. And then now what happens with these tax credits is that they are tradable. They are tradable. If you go online, you can actually trade in carbon credits. So now because they are tradable, the aim is that with time, we know the laws of demand and supply. With time, as they are traded more, the demand increases, the price of these carbon credits will increase, and then now that will eventually disincentivize people from emitting more. So that is how the taxes versus the credits work. So the drawbacks with that is um, unfortunately, there are some institutions who will just emit more because they can afford to emit more. So for example, if I'm in a jurisdiction where there's a certain carbon tax that's applicable, if I can afford to pay it, probably my profits are worth it, then I'll just continue to emit as long as I can pay that high tax. And also on the offset side or the credit side, if I can just afford to buy more credits, then I'll just continue emitting. So in the short term, if you look at the global problem, we might not be able to achieve net zero as quickly as possible if we have people who don't necessarily have the urgency to stop emitting. Yes, in the long run, the carbon credit system should work, but in the short term, the question is, are we going to get there quick enough? And then secondly, I talked about carbon credits and the projects that those credits go towards. For example, a project towards building a forest. So the problem with that is that, fine, it could be a project where a forest is built, but depending on the government that we're talking about, that forest may not be protected. So who is to say that maybe in the next 5-10 years, those trees won't be logged down? And then again, as well, there's also different trees have different rates of absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So basically, the carbon credits, carbon offset system is quite complicated because of such considerations. And then lastly, I would say is that if we look at the global problem of trying to reach net zero emissions, you'll have some countries which have, say, a high carbon price. And so people in that country have a proper disincentive not to emit a lot. But there are some countries where the carbon price is low. So if I'm a manufacturer, right now we are living in a global village, right? So if I'm a manufacturer and I want to emit more, I can simply go and put my operations in the country that has a lower carbon price. So if you look at the bigger picture, we might not get to net zero emissions quick enough if we have different carbon prices all around the world, because basically there's very many ways you can get around it, and that those are some of the challenges that were brought about in the webinar that you talked about in the beginning. Those are some of the challenges around credibility that were brought up, that, you know, why should the price of carbon be $10 in this country and $60 in another country, right? So if we're all tackling one global problem, are we really going to tackle the problem fast enough if I can always just get away around it, or if I have the money to continue paying the tax or whatever, I can just continue? So that is why I would say it's more of a challenge around the loopholes that can be used around this whole system of carbon taxes and carbon credits, if you look at it at a global level.
Okay, that makes sense. It really does. There is a different price for everything. And just thinking about, you know, how the world global economic system works, right? The dollar price, there's a different currency, there's a different currency exchange that is different at every exchange, but we do have one sort of common denominator, like is the dollar. In every country, there's a dollar. There's a dollar that you can use to base it on, that you can now say, oh, based on the dollar, my currency is this. And so we can use that to compare, you know, all other exchange rates just based on the dollar. And of course, this is still subjective, right? Because that a dollar compared to the rand, the South African rand, is very different to the South African rand and dollar comparison in South Africa, right? But we do feel like with the exchange rates, we have the dollar to rely on. So just bringing back to now, I think what everyone is here for, right? We've talked about the actuarial challenge, the pricing. We just want to now talk about what are some of the ways in which we can find at least one price? How can we use our actuarial skills to say, okay, we have a dollar X equivalent of the carbon price, and you can use this to compare in your credit carbon markets, right? Because we need to be realistic. We're not going to have one carbon market. Every country is going to have its own carbon market, right? But we want to be able to have one system that we can all quote unquote rely on and feel that it's integrity. You know, every time you spend, you take your money to the New York Stock Exchange, or you take it to the London Stock Exchange, you don't feel like you've been conned, or you've been bamboozled, or that you've not gotten value. So how can we make this exchange also similar for the carbon price? How can we use our skills to come up with at least one value that we can all compare it? And what do you think are the steps that will take us to that level?
Well, I think I think there's a lot of information already out there. We haven't got the answers, Sheila and I. What we've done is really started a discussion, because we think this is a really important subject that has world implications, particularly African implications. So if you actually look to see what countries are doing, many countries are already done investigations of their carbon emissions, and many have a reasonably successful, in their view, way of introducing a carbon tax. And our article had a table within it that showed the countries that have a carbon tax in already as a fixed price, and I think that went from $1 through to $130, ranging from Poland to Sweden. Those countries have done a certain amount of work already according to their local conditions, where they have got a system of introducing a tax over a period. Some have been going for some decades, and some have done it successfully in terms of not harming the economy, but still introducing a fuel tax or whatever. But what it hasn't done is reduce the emissions for the world stage. Effectively, they've cut their emissions, or they've stabilized their emissions to some extent, but it's still higher than will stop global warming. So I think there's a big research opportunity here to understand, firstly, what countries have already done, and other organizations as well. And on behalf of Africa, my own personal view is that there could be an opportunity for a link, say, between the Actuarial Society of Kenya and the African Union, who've got quite an established organization that aims to try and improve every country in Africa as a kind of a continental voice, rather than the 55 countries or whatever there are, you know, one by one. I think I don't know enough about the African Union, but one idea that I've always thought of is that there should be a greater link, potentially, to offer the actuarial skills to an organization like that actually could then provide resources to come up with the answers here, because it requires looking at what's already been done in terms of research already around the world, what works, what doesn't work. You know, Sheila talked about the offsets, some of which are really good in terms of, you know, ways of capturing carbon and removing carbon from the atmosphere, compared to the forests, which may be a really slow, ineffective way of doing it. So there should be far more credit, more support for the offsets that work, and less support for the offsets that are actually just cheating the system, greenwashing, if you want. So I think there's you know, because of the modelling skills, particularly of the general insurance actuary and catastrophe and the like, there's the opportunity for a number of models to be created that says what is the equation between increasing a tax and reducing emissions. You know, the higher the tax, wouldn't it be great to have a model that said the more tax you pay, the greater the emission reduction, and then find the balance of how are we going to achieve this 2% or 1.5%, because the rest of us are just, we've no idea at the moment. We're relying on others, we're relying on governments, and I don't think governments alone have the answers to this. I think scientists have, actuaries can play their part, etc. So I think there's great opportunities.
Great. And just in line with the theme of how we can collaborate more and how we can come together and maybe, come up with our process, using the society, the organization, the ESG, the actuary bodies that are there. How do you think that we can also harness the power of this one great voice and institutions like the African Union, right? Because this is one of the places that President Ruto talked about, is like having one concisive voice. How can those organizations collaborate to come up with one sort of price? Because the next thing that we're going to have to deal with is the carbon markets, right? How do we regulate them? How do we harmonize them? How do you think that collaboration will play out? One, between professional bodies, between the African institutions, and thirdly, with the regulation. How do you think those three can interplay to enable us to at least have harmonization or integrity with the carbon credits that we are seeing in the market?
Well, if you, as the East African Actuarial Society, if you believe it's an important issue, then one way is to see how many people are interested in actually giving time to try and solve the problem. And are there, I don't know about the other actuarial societies in Africa, whether you should link to see whether you've got similarly, what you need is a group of people and resources. Now, whether you need consultancy help as well, it's ideal area for the consultancy to make money, but I'm not here to support the consultancies making more money. And I know time is limited for volunteers, particularly when most people have got a full-time job as well. But there is an opportunity to link with others. And I don't know anything about the African Union, but I suspect from the internet I see that that it's split into departments and there are department heads. The answer is just contact them and start a conversation, isn't it? And there are others outside of Africa that would help or should help as well. Most people here are part of the IFOA, so they've got a sustainability board, etc. They should be helping as well. I sit in the UK, and I might criticize myself how much the IFOA has done, but I think they could be challenged to do more and help find the answer. Certainly in COVID, some actuaries got involved to help try and find solutions and build models around COVID. And the same thing happened with AIDS as well. So, there are precedents for it.
That is well said. That perhaps the Actuarial Society and the Actuarial Society of Kenya, with the ESG task force, should take this sort of the role of collaborating with the rest of Africa actuarial organizations to set up with this. Sheila, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that, we are conscious that already these conversations are happening all around the world. And even with the release of the new IFRS standards on climate change. So I think what John and I are saying is that we need an actuarial voice and an African voice, so that by the time we are receiving guidelines, by the time the conversation is happening, we are not just observers or participants. We actually have our own opinion. And I guess what we're trying to say is that we have actuarial skills. As the African continent, we are the most affected by climate change. So we should have our own very coherent voice, and it should be a scientific voice. It shouldn't be a voice that is sort of just receiving what we are being told, but we should actually give our opinion. And that's why I loved how you started the webinar by saying, let's all attend the Africa Climate Summit week, so that we can actually start lending our voices. So it's about being more active voices in the conversation, because it's not that it's not happening, it is happening, but it's important for us to actually give our voice because we are the most affected.
Mm. Sheila, are you wanting to turn us into activists by lending our voices? You know, in Kenya, we already have maandamano. Guess we have got to
Well,
start undermining against climate change. Thank you so much. So
when you're lending a scientific voice,
it's
we'll
different,
label
I
it
see.
as it's different.
And
Yeah.
so before we close, we are gonna move into question time shortly. Before we get parting shots from our presenters. So if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and I'm just gonna do it from first person who raises their hand will get the first opportunity to raise a question. So I'm gonna leave it to John to give some parting shots, and then Sheila, and then we're gonna move into question time. But keep raising your hand so that we can be able to moderate that. Thanks. Yes, John, please.
Yeah, sorry.
For your parting shot on this conversation. Or
Well,
is it collaborate, collaborate, collaborate?
well, sorry, I didn't pick up on your prompt. Firstly, thank everyone for letting us come and talk to you. We aren't experts. We came across the topic because we've got a mutual interest in both climate and Africa. We were looking for things that we thought were important, and carbon pricing came up. And actually, having read about it, it feels to me far more important than I first realised when I came across the subject. And we see the evidence of this, as I said, with, turn the news on all the time. We are facing problems. And you gave us a challenge: should we be activists? The answer is, well, yes, in an actuarial way, perhaps, rather than a politically or other way. Although there is a question in my mind: should we also get involved a little bit in politics, in that we actually have to be influencers of governments and the like to make change, and we have to try and persuade them that making change is economically sensible. We need to understand the economics, we need to understand the science. We won't know that on our own. We aren't experts at everything, but actually we have to learn a little bit more all the time. All of us have to learn more about climate and what we can do both individually on a day-to-day basis at home, and what we can do collectively at a far higher level, at governmental level, or even continental level. So this may be a journey, and I hope it's a quick journey, because it needs speed.
Thank you. Thank you for those comments, John. And Sheila, for your parting thoughts.
I think my parting thought would be, if you look at the last paragraph in our article, we didn't give a solution. We were basically inviting everyone for us to think about it and to have a discussion. And so my parting shot would be, it was an invitation. We are inviting us, and I'm so happy that we are finishing a bit early, because now we have lots of time for questions. We are opening the floor for that discussion, so that we can come up with that one African and or actuarial voice. Then I'll start by giving a very interesting example. I've recently been rerunning episodes of Big Bang Theory, for those who know Big Bang Theory. And I've been watching as well the actors of Big Bang Theory when they're being interviewed about the series, and why it was like one of the greatest series in America that's ever been on air. And one of the things that really piqued my interest, they said, was that it wasn't just because the cast was awesome, it was also because the script was awesome. So it took so many different elements. The script had to be great, the actors had to do their part, the actors had to be really good actors, and so on, for them to have more than 200 plus episodes, right? So everyone had to play their part. And so my parting shot would be that for us to achieve net zero, it can no longer just be a thing of, yeah, those climate change people, those change experts, let's do their thing, it doesn't concern me. No, for us to actually achieve that global goal, we actually all have to contribute. And yes, climate change does concern you. And I believe our audience is mostly actuarial. As actuaries, we can provide much more knowledge and much more input into the conversation. So yes, thanks, Lauren.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And now we'll go into the questions. I did see some couple of hands up. So maybe if Isaac, you wanna go ahead with your question. I have allowed you to speak. Wilson also raised their hand. You can feel free to let me unmute you, Wilson, I guess. Yes, go ahead, Isaac. Please unmute yourself before you speak. Unfortunately, we can't hear that. Maybe just put your question in the chat box then, and I can ask it for you. We also have a question from Portia, and she asks, how can one start a career in carbon pricing, especially as an early career professional?
Lorraine, maybe you might be best placed to answer that question.
Okay, great. I can answer that. So there are a number of ways you can get involved in not just carbon pricing, right? Because carbon pricing is it's a one big arm of ESG, right? Which is the environment, social, and governance aspect that we're all trying to bring. And inherently, it's just a sustainability principle. So for me, the first thing is to get yourself into sustainable insurance, right? For us, I'm an insurance expert, so I'm very biased in talking about insurance. I'm not just an expert, I've worked in insurance for a long time. So I only have insurance knowledge. So I would suggest get yourself in an insurance space, volunteer to take part in these initiatives, volunteer to join the ESG task force, volunteer in all other ESG or sustainability spaces you are, so that you not only have insight to what is being done and what you can do and what you can harness your skills in, so that you already start by doing without the price of failure. When you volunteer, anytime you make a mistake or you fail, the cost is very low, so there's a lot of room to growth when you volunteer. So I would suggest start by volunteering. Is there an ESG champion in your organization? Is there an ESG conversation happening in your organization? Start by being the person who's bringing this to the forefront, and you'll find that the cost of failure, the cost that you put in, will be less than the gain that you'll make eventually in the long run. So I would start by challenging you to find spaces to volunteer in and to lend your voice, and come to the Africa Climate Summit Week. You will meet a lot of people who are in the space, and you can get ideas on what you can do. So I hope that answers your question. Ed, I have allowed your mic. You can ask your question. You had a challenge in the chat, so please go ahead.
Hi everyone. So my name is Edward Ngari. I'm a carbon project developer, and I understand where the country is. Currently, the carbon trading will be between the aviation sector and agriculture. Then there's going to be a lot of carbon emissions conversations in trade going to Europe. Europe they have a climate law. And so everything that goes to Europe via ship or via air will pay for carbon credits. So that's an opportunity. I'm looking at a situation where giving a scenario as it is, actuary needs to relate with the carbon project developer and the research institutions. There's a lot of data that is there with scientists in research firms, but it is not related to the economy because previously agriculture has been running on donor models which are not relevant. I'm also welcoming you. I'm a statistician, so I understand how to speak data. Then the relation between actuarial and carbon projects is in the methodology. There's a way data is collected for carbon projects, and then there's a way you guys do your actuarial. So there's that opportunity to work on that. I've being in this space, there's a very huge opportunity in the capital markets, and when we are there, we don't have the actuaries there, and the role that actuaries need to play. And from my experience, it has to relate with IFRS 17. So there's a way from a carbon project perspective, from the works we are doing, we would relate with the actuaries to the IFRS 17. So karibuni, and we Moya and Kirinyaga for coffee.
Okay, well, we also want to welcome you to the ESG task force where you can lend your voice, because we are trying to have the conversation, and having a carbon expert and someone who's already thinking about aviation and agriculture and how we can use that knowledge to influence our regulation so that we can have at least a credible carbon market is something that we would welcome. So we welcome you as well to the ESG task force, and we will be reaching out after the webinar. So thank you so much for your contribution. We had a question from Isaac. I don't know if you're Isaac, you're ready, and then Modoni, you could go next. I have unmuted you. Over to you, Isaac. You did have a comment and a challenge. We welcome those. Okay, Isaac is still not ready. So Modani, could you please ask your question?
Hello, everyone. My name is Modani Njue. I'm not an actuary, I'm an advocate. And I have learned so much from the wonderful insights from Sheila and John. So thank you very much. I was just looking at the, while you were speaking, I was just looking at the potential regressive impact that carbon pricing can have on low income individuals, stroke vulnerable communities. Carbon pricing can lead to, the increase an increase in the cost of fossil fuels, which can then have an impact on the basic necessities for low-income individuals. So I'm just curious to know, how do you as actuaries address concerns about the potential regressive impact of carbon pricing on low-income individuals? Thank you very much.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking. I don't know who wants to go first.
So I think governments have a whole range of taxes to apply, and some are means tested and some aren't. So we have things like value added tax in the UK, which is applied across the board, no matter who you are. And then you have means tested, and in the UK, there's a benefit system that compensates those who are needy, where they're buying food and that food is taxed, but if they haven't got enough money, then they're compensated. So that's down to individual countries and the way they apply the tax. For carbon taxes, on a global basis, the biggest emitters are probably in UK, Asia, and America, and there needs to be a global accountability that says the biggest emitters should have the biggest taxes, the biggest price. And that's where the research and I think one of the issues that President Ruto raised was the fact that Africa is strong on resources but actually very low on emissions. So why should the same carbon tax apply on fuel or whatever in a country that is a low user compared to countries that extract far more and burn far more? So that kind of debate needs to happen at COP and other United Nations or wherever, which feels well beyond our remit, but we understand that inequity, and I think the African Union could be one means of helping fight that inequity and solving that particular problem, because the same price shouldn't apply to everyone.
Okay.
Yeah, I can add to that and say, Wozoni, that's a very good question, because just to add on what John is saying, that's why we are saying that it's urgent that we add our African voice to the conversation, because it's true. Our emissions are like negligible, but we're the ones who are suffering the most. And so if we can have that global conversation, then we can come up with something that is actually fair to Africa, where we have a lot of low income people. And maybe just to allude to an example that was discussed in the webinar that we quoted in our article, there was the example of the pipeline that's being built in Uganda right now, being built from Uganda to Tanzania. And so they are exploiting their oil resources. So the conversation was around the fact that, okay, it's well and good to say that Uganda should not exploit its oil resources, but shouldn't they then get compensation for seeking alternative sources of fuel instead? So Mudhoni, those are actually the kind of conversations that we want to start evoking. And that now drills down back to a carbon price, because as John said, if we have the conversations around carbon pricing, carbon taxes, then that will drill down to, okay, so what is the equitable or fair way for these taxes to be paid by different countries?
Okay, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much for the numerous questions that I have seen on the chat around, the emissions trading system, around water emission factors. We've also had questions around how do we prevent more emissions? And unfortunately, we had planned for only 1 hour. So we're going to have to reach out to those conversations. But I really do want to thank you all for joining, and to say that we'll be reaching out just to discuss the rest of the questions with JK and with Michelle and with Chelsea and Dennis, who have asked additional questions. We will be having a follow-up webinar that will just be solely around carbon markets, because we now need to speak to the experts to say, okay, we know there's an issue. How can we support you, right? Because we're going to have to include everyone in the conversation. So we'll be announcing when we'll have a conversation about carbon pricing and interaction with the carbon markets and what we can do. How can we lend our voice? How can we support? And we'll announce that. And just before I leave, I just want to say once again, please come through to the Africa Climate Summit Week. It's free for everyone. You just need to register, show up at KICC, interact with all the players who are making these decisions so that we can see how we can influence them more. So without further ado, I want to give you back 2 minutes of your time, given that we already made you wait for at least 30 minutes. So we hope that that will at least make your day. Thank you so much. Goodbye. Thank you so much for
Thank you.
joining.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
you.
Thank you. Augustine has a question. The webinar is down. Thank you for joining, everyone. Goodbye. I hope you all have wonderful days as you leave. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. Thank you for joining. Looking forward to seeing you next time. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining.
Okay, I think now it's just the speakers.
Yeah, John also left. So you want to debrief?
Yeah, I think it's always nice to debrief immediately after a
Immediately,
meeting.
because you remember the points. Yeah, cool.
Yeah,
Let's go. You go first.
I think it went really well. And the most exciting part for me was that this is a conversation that people are interested in. And there's so many